What happens when two stars from completely different paths collide on screen and create a kind of magic that no script could ever fully capture? Hollywood has given us many love stories, but only a few have felt so real that audiences forgot they were watching fiction. In the mid-1980s, one such story unfolded, not only in front of the cameras, but in the lives of the two actors who brought it to life. Sally Field, the actress America adored, and James Garner, the man everyone trusted as Hollywood's true gentleman, once shared a connection so authentic that decades later, people still talk about it. Their film together, Murphy's Romance, wasn't just a charming romantic comedy. It was a moment in time when two lives, two careers, and two legacies intersected in a way that could never be repeated. To watch them together on screen was to witness something that seemed effortless. Their laughter felt unforced, their affection believable, their bond undeniable. There was no trace of acting. It felt as though the audience had stumbled into a private conversation, a tender unfolding of friendship and attraction that was far too real to be rehearsed. Critics called it chemistry, but those who saw it knew it was something deeper. And now, at the age of 78, Sally Field has finally spoken up about what James Garner meant to her. Her words are not just about one role or one kiss in a film. They are about the kind of rare connection that defines an entire career, about the respect and warmth of a man who carried himself with grace in an industry where kindness was too often in short supply. For Sally, speaking of Garner so many years later is more than nostalgia, it's testimony. But to truly understand why her reflections matter, why audiences still remember this pairing nearly 40 years later, we need to step back. We need to trace the path that led both of these legends to that quiet Arizona town where Murphy's Romance was set. We need to see how the scars of their past, the battles they fought, and the victories they claimed shaped not only their careers but also the way they connected with one another. Sally Field's story begins not in Hollywood glamour but in the suburbs of Pasadena, where a young girl was learning how to survive in a fractured home, finding solace in performance while hiding pain behind a smile. She was America's sweetheart on television, yet inside she was restless, desperate to be seen for her talent rather than her dimples. James Garner's story, meanwhile, begins in Depression-era Oklahoma, where poverty and hardship were daily realities, and where the loss of his mother at a tender age left a wound he carried for life. He grew into a man who fought wars, bore scars, and yet somehow emerged with the most disarming quality of all, gentleness. Two lives, two journeys, neither easy, both marked by hardship and resilience. And then, somehow, they found themselves face-to-face on a Hollywood set in 1985, asked to tell the story of a small-town romance between a single mother and a wise, kind-hearted pharmacist. What could have been just another film became instead a landmark in their careers, a film that not only earned critical acclaim but also cemented their legacies as performers who could make audiences believe in love again. When Sally Field speaks of James Garner today, she doesn't talk about box office numbers or studio contracts. She talks about the way he treated her, the way he respected her, and the way he embodied something rare in the entertainment industry, authenticity. And when audiences revisit Murphy's Romance, they aren't just watching a romantic comedy. They are seeing two lives at their most open, two actors giving the best of themselves not only to the camera but to each other. This isn't just a Hollywood story, it's a human story. It's about how pain can turn into strength, how respect can turn into chemistry, and how even a single film can echo across decades because the truth behind it was real. At 78, when Sally Field finally spoke up about James Garner, she gave the world not only a memory of a man she cherished but also a reminder that the best stories in Hollywood are not the scandals whispered about in tabloids, but the quiet, enduring connections that stand the test of time. And so, as we look back at the lives of Sally Field and James Garner, at the path that brought them together and the legacies they left behind, we step into a story bigger than fame or film. We step into a story of resilience, respect, and the kind of chemistry that only happens once in a lifetime. Sally Field was born on November 6, 1946, in Pasadena, California, a place often painted as sun-soaked, suburban perfection. Pasadena, with its tree-lined streets and well-kept lawns, projected the image of middle-class stability. Yet inside the Field household, stability was fragile, and happiness came with shadows. Her mother, Margaret Field, was an actress who had experienced her own brush with Hollywood but never quite found lasting stardom. She knew the glamour and the disappointment of the film industry firsthand. Her father, Richard Field, worked as a salesman, trying to provide for the family, but the marriage was turbulent and eventually collapsed. Divorce was still frowned upon in post-war America, and Sally's early childhood was shaped by that upheaval. When Margaret remarried, it seemed on the surface like a step toward security. Her new husband, Jock Mahoney, was a stuntman and actor, tall, rugged, and charismatic. But behind closed doors, Mahoney became the darkest presence in young Sally's life. In her memoir In Pieces, published decades later in 2018, she revealed the truth she had carried in silence for so long. Mahoney sexually abused her as a child. The betrayal cut deep. For years, she bottled the pain, unable to speak it aloud. That trauma, though devastating, planted the seeds of the emotional intensity that would later fuel her performances. She learned to live behind masks, to project light while hiding turmoil, a duality that would become her artistic strength. Her first big break came almost by accident. After high school, she was encouraged to audition for a television role, and in 1965, at the age of 18, Sally was cast in Gidget. The series was based on the popular surf novels and films of the era, telling the story of a fun-loving teenager navigating life and love in Southern California. The show didn't last long, just one season, but it introduced Sally Field to America. With her wide smile and fresh-faced charm, she was instantly likable, the girl next door that viewers wanted to root for. From there came The Flying Nun in 1967, a sitcom as improbable as its title. Sally played Sister Bertrill, a novice nun whose habit was so wide and aerodynamic that it allowed her to literally fly. The concept was silly, but audiences loved it. For 3 seasons, millions tuned in to watch the petite young actress float across television screens. It made her a household name. Yet for Sally, it was a prison. Hollywood now saw her as a lightweight comedy actress, cute, perky, amusing, but not serious. She later admitted that she dreaded the role and felt humiliated by it. It wasn't the work she wanted to do, but at 20 years old, she didn't yet have the power to say no. Behind the smile, Sally was aching for more. She wanted to be seen, truly seen, as an actress capable of depth. And in the mid-1970s, she found the courage to change course. She enrolled in acting classes with the legendary Lee Strasberg, the famed teacher of method acting whose students included Marlon Brando, Al Pacino, and Marilyn Monroe. Strasberg didn't see the flying nun. He saw a woman with extraordinary potential, someone who could channel her personal pain into raw, powerful performances. His mentorship gave her both the tools and the confidence to break free from the roles that had trapped her. That turning point became visible to the world in 1976 with Sybil. In this made-for-television film, Sally played a young woman suffering from dissociative identity disorder, fractured into multiple personalities as a result of childhood abuse. The role was emotionally grueling, demanding that she shift from childlike innocence to violent rage to desperate vulnerability, sometimes within a single scene. Critics were stunned. Audiences who had once laughed at Sister Bertrill now sat in awe. Sally Field, it turned out, wasn't just a TV star. She was an actress of breathtaking depth. Her performance earned her an Emmy and changed the course of her career forever. Just 3 years later, in 1979, she took on Norma Ray. The story of a Southern textile worker turned union organizer resonated with the political and social struggles of the time. Sally's portrayal of a woman standing up against exploitation was fierce, unpolished, and deeply human. When she won the Academy Award for Best Actress, it wasn't just a personal triumph. It was validation that she had escaped the pigeonhole of her early career. She was now one of Hollywood's leading actresses. Then, in 1984, she won her second Oscar for Places in the Heart, playing a widow struggling to keep her farm afloat during the Great Depression. With that performance, Sally cemented her reputation as one of the finest actresses of her generation. Few performers could move so seamlessly between vulnerability and strength, humor and heartbreak. Behind the professional triumphs, Sally's personal life was far more complicated. She married twice, first to Stephen Craig, with whom she had 2 sons, Peter and Eli. The marriage ended in divorce. Later, she married producer Alan Griezmann, and they had a son, Sam, before divorcing as well. But her most famous relationship was with Burt Reynolds, one of Hollywood's biggest stars of the 1970s. Their romance, which began during the filming of Smokey and the Bandit, captured headlines and lasted several years. Together, they made 4 films. On screen, they seemed inseparable, the golden couple of the era. But behind the scenes, their relationship was often turbulent. Reynolds could be controlling, sometimes emotionally difficult, and the romance that looked picture-perfect to the public was far more complicated in reality. When Sally released a memoir in pieces in 2018, she revealed truths she had carried in silence for decades. She spoke openly about the abuse she suffered at the hands of a stepfather, about the abortion she had as a teenager, and about the difficult, complicated ties with Burt Reynolds. She described him as controlling and insecure, admitting that their relationship was not the fairy tale it appeared to be. Her honesty shocked many, but it also helped people understand just how much she had endured and how much strength it had taken to carve out the career she built. Through all of it, Sally Field remained resilient. Her journey was never a straight line, but she never stopped pushing forward, never stopped demanding that she be seen for her full humanity, not just a smile or a stereotype. She came to embody what Hollywood often overlooks, authenticity. By the time she turned 78, Sally Field had lived 6 decades in the spotlight. She had played teenagers, mothers, widows, activists, and icons. She had been underestimated, dismissed, celebrated, and crowned with 2 Academy Awards. But more than anything, her life stood as proof that survival can coexist with artistry, that scars can become sources of strength, and that sometimes the sweetest faces hide the fiercest fighters. And when she looked back, reflecting not just on her own life but on the people she had crossed paths with, James Garner among them, her words carried the weight of survival and triumph. She was no longer just America's sweetheart. She was America's survivor, storyteller, and one of the greatest actresses of her time. James Garner was born James Scott Bumgarner on April 7, 1928, in Norman, Oklahoma. Norman was a small town, a place where neighbors knew one another and children roamed freely through dusty streets. But for young James, childhood was never carefree. His mother died when he was only 5 years old, leaving him and his 2 older brothers in the care of a father who was emotionally distant and overwhelmed, and a stepmother whose cruelty left deep scars. Garner would later describe her as abusive, and the home he grew up in as anything but safe. That sense of being unprotected shaped him for life. By his teenage years, Garner was already restless. School never held his attention, and the roughness of home pushed him toward independence. He left as soon as he could, taking odd jobs just to survive. He worked as a lifeguard, a carpet layer, even a model for men's swimsuits and department store ads. There was no plan, no dream of Hollywood stardom. Garner was simply trying to get by. Then came war. At the tail end of World War II, he served briefly in the Merchant Marine, and a few years later, he joined the Army during the Korean War. Combat was brutal. Garner was wounded twice and received 2 Purple Hearts. He would later joke, in his typically self-deprecating way, that one was for being shot in the rear. But behind the humor was a man shaped by hardship. War gave him a sense of toughness. Yes, but it also gave him perspective. He knew what real danger felt like, what real pain was, and that knowledge would stay with him long after he returned home. It gave him a certain groundedness that audiences would one day recognize on screen. His entry into acting was almost accidental. After returning from the war, a friend encouraged him to try theater. Garner ended up working as an extra on Broadway, standing silently in the background of productions like the Caine Mutiny Court-Martial. At first, he didn't take acting seriously. He admitted he spent most of his time studying the other performers and thinking about how much easier it was than the hard labor jobs he'd been doing. But slowly, he realized he had something rare, an effortless charm, a kind of presence that didn't need to be forced. That quiet ease translated beautifully to television. In 1957, Garner landed the role that would make him famous, Brett Maverick in the Western series Maverick. Westerns were everywhere on TV at the time, but Garner's take was different. His Maverick wasn't the typical stoic, gunslinging cowboy. He was witty, sly, and reluctant to fight unless he had no other choice. He preferred to outthink his opponents rather than outshoot them. Audiences loved it. Overnight, James Garner became a household name. But Garner never let fame go to his head. He often said that acting was just a job, and he treated it like one. He didn't buy into Hollywood's obsession with image or prestige. What made him stand out was precisely that. He seemed real. He wasn't the brooding method actor or the glamorous matinee idol. He was a guy you wanted as a neighbor, the man you could trust, the everyman who just happened to be on your TV screen. As the 1960s rolled in, Garner transitioned to films. His reign surprised people. In The Great Escape, 1963, he played Henley, the scrounger, holding his own alongside Steve McQueen in a stacked ensemble cast. In The Americanization of Emily, 1964, he showed his flair for romantic comedy, balancing charm with thoughtful depth. He could move between comedy, drama, and westerns with ease. Unlike other stars of his era, he didn't rely on flash or bravado. His strength was subtlety, a rare quality in a business built on spectacle. Yet Garner's career wasn't without struggles. In the 1960s, he clashed with Warner Brothers, the studio behind Maverick. Tired of being underpaid and overworked, he sued the studio, a bold move at a time when few actors dared challenge the system. And he won. That victory not only gave him more freedom, but also established his reputation as someone who wouldn't be pushed around. Later, in the 1980s, he sued Universal for similar reasons and won again. Behind his easygoing on-screen persona was a man who believed in fairness and wasn't afraid to fight for it. The 1970s brought another defining role, Jim Rockford in the Rockford Files. Rockford was a private investigator, but not the tough, hard-boiled type audiences we're used to. He lived in a mobile home, constantly worried about money, and often tried to avoid conflict rather than dive into it. He was witty, resourceful, and entirely human. The role fit Garner like a glove. Viewers loved him, critics praised him, and in 1977, he won an Emmy for his performance. Garner once said that Rockford was the closest he ever came to playing himself. The humor, the reluctance to fight, the compassion, all of it reflected who he was off-screen. That was his magic. Audiences never felt like they were watching an actor perform. They felt like they were watching James Garner be himself. Even as he aged, Garner's career never slowed. In the 1980s, he charmed a new generation of viewers in romantic comedies like Murphy's Romance, opposite Sally Field, proving he could still hold the screen with warmth and humor. In the 1990s, he appeared in Space Cowboys alongside Clint Eastwood and Tommy Lee Jones, showing he could still play tough but lovable. And in 2004, he broke hearts worldwide in The Notebook, playing the older Noah, a man reading his love story to his wife, who no longer remembered him. That performance introduced him to a new generation, cementing his place as a timeless presence in American cinema. But perhaps what mattered most was how Garner was remembered off-screen. Colleagues consistently described him as one of the kindest men in Hollywood. Professional, generous, respectful, he was the opposite of the diva stereotype. Sally Field would later say that working with him felt safe, that his warmth made everything easier. That reputation wasn't just for show. Garner lived a long, stable marriage to his wife, Lois Clark, whom he married in 1956. Despite the ups and downs of Hollywood life, they stayed together for nearly 58 years until his passing. In a town known for breakups and scandals, that kind of partnership was almost unheard of. James Garner passed away on July 19, 2014, at the age of 86. His death was mourned not just by fans, but by generations of actors who had admired him. Tributes poured in, all echoing the same theme. Garner was authentic. He was a rare star who never pretended to be anything other than himself. His legacy endures not because of one role or one era, but because he embodied something timeless: decency. He played characters you wanted to root for, men who weren't perfect but who were honest, funny, and deeply human. And in an industry often built on illusion, James Garner's greatest strength was that he never lost his authenticity. By the mid-1980s, Sally Field was not just a celebrated actress. She was a force. After 2 Academy Award wins and a string of acclaimed performances, she had built enough clout in Hollywood to push for projects she believed in. And when Murphy's Romance came across her desk, she knew it had the potential to be something special. The film, directed by Martin Ritt, a man Field deeply respected and had worked with before on Norma Ray, told the story of Emma Moriarty, a divorced mother determined to make a fresh start in a dusty Arizona town. The script was gentle, human, and quietly funny. It wasn't about explosions or melodrama. It was about second chances, resilience, and unexpected companionship. It was, in many ways, a reflection of the lives both Field and James Garner had lived, complicated pasts, battles fought, and the search for something genuine. But the studio wasn't convinced. Casting Emma was easy. Sally was attached from the beginning. Casting Murphy Jones, however, became a fight. Field knew who she wanted, James Garner. By then, Garner was in his late 50s, beloved by audiences but not exactly the hot new star the executives wanted. The suits thought he was too old, too gentle, not bankable enough for a romantic lead. Field pushed back. She argued that Garner brought something no one else could, authenticity. Murphy Jones had to feel lived in, real, and quietly magnetic. Field insisted that only Garner could play him. This wasn't a casual request. It was a battle. Field, who had fought hard to step into the role of producer, a rarity for actresses at the time, staked her reputation on her choice. She told Ritt in the studio that if they wanted her in the film, they had to give her Garner. Eventually, she won. That decision would define the movie, and in some ways, it would define her relationship with Garner for the rest of her life. When filming began in 1985, something remarkable happened. The pairing of Field and Garner simply worked. On paper, their age difference raised eyebrows. She was in her late 30s, he was pushing 60, but on screen, none of that mattered. Their chemistry wasn't the kind that relied on fiery passion or grand gestures. Instead, it was warm, witty, and full of quiet affection. They looked at each other as if they genuinely liked one another, and in truth, they did. Audiences noticed the little things, the playful banter, the gentle teasing, the way their characters seemed to fall into a rhythm that felt lived in rather than performed. There was no forced romance, no Hollywood gloss. It was two people slowly recognizing in each other the possibility of companionship, respect, and love. One moment in particular became legendary, the kiss. For Sally Field, who had kissed many leading men in her career, this one stood out above all. She would later admit it was the best kiss of her entire career, the most real, the most sincere, coming from a woman who had shared the screen and her personal life. With Burt Reynolds, that confession carried weight. She described Garner's kiss as genuine, unhurried, filled with tenderness. It wasn't just acting. It felt like truth caught on film. For James Garner, Murphy's romance was also a turning point. Though he had been a star since Maverick and the Rockford Files, by the mid-'80s Hollywood had largely moved on to younger faces. Yet here he was, carrying a romantic comedy opposite one of the era's most acclaimed actresses. His performance earned him an Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, the only Oscar nomination of his career. That recognition, so late in his career, was bittersweet. It was proof of what his fans had always known. Garner had a gift for making people believe in goodness. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere was just as special. Field admired Garner's professionalism. He arrived prepared, knew his lines, and treated everyone on set with kindness. There were no tantrums, no ego battles. Garner had survived Hollywood long enough to know that the work mattered more than the noise. For Field, who had endured controlling partners and dismissive studio executives, his steadiness felt like a balm. She later said that working with Garner felt safe, and that safety allowed her to give even more to her performance. Garner, in turn, was impressed by Field's tenacity and talent. He had always admired actresses who took risks, who didn't let Hollywood box them in. To him, Sally wasn't just a co-star. She was a fighter, someone who had clawed her way from sitcom fluff to Oscar glory. He respected her not just as an actress, but as a producer who had fought tooth and nail to make the film her way. And while gossip magazines tried to speculate about whether their on-screen romance had spilled over into real life, the truth was simpler and, perhaps, even more beautiful. No, they weren't lovers. They didn't need to be. What they shared was mutual admiration, affection, and a kind of bond that transcended romance. Their connection was rooted in respect, in laughter, in the comfort of knowing they had found a partner who could meet them as equals on screen. When Murphy's romance premiered, audiences responded with warmth. The film wasn't a blockbuster, but it struck a chord. People saw themselves in Emma and Murphy, in their hesitations, their humor, their slow discovery that life could still surprise them. Garner's Oscar nomination brought new recognition to his long career, and Field proved once again that she was more than just a performer. She was a storyteller with vision. Decades later, people still talk about the film. Younger audiences, discovering it for the first time, are often struck by how fresh the chemistry feels, how different it is from the loud, formulaic romances of today. And whenever Sally Field is asked about James Garner, she inevitably returns to Murphy's romance. She remembers the kindness, the steadiness, and yes, that kiss, a moment that, even years later, still makes her smile. For both of them, the film was more than just a job. It was a meeting of spirits. Sally, at that point in her life, was navigating the challenges of balancing career, motherhood, and complicated relationships. Garner, nearing the later chapters of his career, was proving he still had more to give. Together, they created something timeless, a love story that was gentle, genuine, and deeply human. Nearly 4 decades have passed since Murphy's romance. Yet for Sally Field, James Garner remains as vivid in memory as if he had just stepped off set yesterday. Time has not dimmed the warmth she felt toward him. If anything, the years have clarified it. At 78, with a career spanning 6 decades and a life filled with triumphs, heartbreaks, and revelations, Sally has reached a stage where she speaks with disarming honesty. And when she speaks about James Garner, her words are tinged with both admiration and something softer, gratitude. In interviews and in her memoir, Sally has contrasted Garner with the men who loomed large in her life. Burt Reynolds, her most famous romantic partner, was magnetic but often turbulent, controlling, complicated, sometimes tender, sometimes hurtful. Garner, by contrast, was none of those things. He was steady. He was calm. He was, in her words, safe. That safety was not dullness. It was strength. It was a presence that gave her space to breathe, to perform, to be herself without fear of judgment or manipulation. On the set of Murphy's romance, this difference was striking. Garner wasn't trying to dominate the spotlight. He wasn't competing. Instead, he lifted her up, allowed her space to shine, and in doing so, their chemistry became effortless. Sally has admitted that when she remembers a film today, she doesn't just recall the lines of dialogue or the blocking of scenes. She remembers the way Garner's eyes softened when they met Hayes. She remembers how he listened, not just as an actor hitting cues, but as a man who truly paid attention. And then there's the kiss. Of all the screen kisses in her career, with Reynolds, with James Caan, with Jeff Bridges, with Robin Williams, it is James Garner's kiss that Sally still calls the best. That moment wasn't about fireworks or passion in the Hollywood sense. It was about sincerity. Garner kissed as if Murphy Jones himself were real, as if his affection for Emma Moriarty wasn't a line in a script, but a truth he believed in. For Sally, it blurred the line between performance and reality in a way that has lingered with her for decades. To hear her describe it now is to understand something deeper, that Garner, in many ways, represented the kind of goodness that often feels missing in Hollywood. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't scandalous. He didn't play games with the press. Instead, he carried himself with integrity in his career, in his personal life, and in the way he treated others. At 78, Sally Field knows the cost of surviving Hollywood. She has spoken openly about the abuse she endured as a child, the difficult marriages, the pressures of being typecast, and the battles she fought for serious roles. She has lived through eras when women were treated as commodities, when silence was expected, when speaking up could end a career. Against that backdrop, her memories of Garner stand out all the more. He was proof that kindness could exist in a cutthroat industry. He was evidence that professionalism and generosity were not weaknesses but strengths. Her reflections are not just about nostalgia, they are about legacy. James Garner's death in 2014 closed a chapter on one of Hollywood's most quietly remarkable careers, but through Sally's voice, his spirit lingers. She reminds us that he wasn't just Jim Rockford or Brett Maverick, or the charming widow of Murphy's romance. He was a man who showed grace when he could have chosen arrogance, who chose humility in a world addicted to ego. For Sally Field, speaking about Garner now is also a way of speaking about herself. Her career has been defined by resilience, by refusing to be boxed in, by surviving pain and still telling her truth. When she recalls Garner with such tenderness, it reflects what she values most after all these years: authenticity, decency, respect. In many ways, her words about him are also a reminder to herself, and to all of us, that what endures is not glamour or gossip, but the quiet connections we make with people who see us clearly. In a world where Hollywood history is filled with scandals, broken promises, and fleeting romances, Sally's reflections on James Garner offer something rare: a story of trust, of partnership, of a bond that never needed to be romantic to be profound. And that is perhaps why her words resonate so deeply now. Because when Sally Field, at 78, finally speaks up about James Garner, she is not just remembering a co-star. She is honoring a man who showed her, and the world, that kindness could be just as powerful as charisma, and that sometimes the best love stories are the ones built not on passion, but on respect. Sally Field and James Garner came from very different beginnings. She was a California girl who grew up in the shadow of Hollywood but had to fight tooth and nail to be taken seriously as more than a sitcom ingenue. He was the Oklahoma boy who survived loss, hardship, and even the horrors of war before stumbling into acting almost by accident, carrying with him a humility that never left. Their paths shouldn't have crossed, and yet in 1985, they did. In Murphy's Romance, what emerged wasn't just another mid-'80s romantic comedy. It was lightning in a bottle, a story carried not by flashy special effects over-the-top melodrama, but by the small, almost invisible truths between two people. The glances, the pauses, the kind of unspoken tenderness that feels more real than anything a screenwriter can put on a page. That was Sally and James. That was their gift. When Sally Field, at 78, finally spoke up about James Garner, she wasn't indulging in gossip or trying to rehash an old Hollywood memory. She was doing something far more powerful. She was naming, out loud, the qualities that matter most after a lifetime in an industry that too often confuses success with excess. She remembered James Garner as kind, as respectful, as a man who gave her the best on-screen kiss of her career not because it was fiery, but because it was genuine, because it was honest. Their story reminds us of something rare in the world of celebrity, that the relationships which endure in memory are not always the dramatic love affairs splashed across tabloids, but the quiet partnerships built on trust, respect, and admiration. Garner and Field never became a couple off-screen, but their connection was no less profound. It was professional, yes, but it was also deeply human. Even now, years after Garner's passing in 2014, his legacy continues to ripple outward, in the roles he left behind, in the standards of decency he upheld, and in the words of those, like Sally Field, who keep his spirit alive through remembrance. For her, speaking about him isn't just nostalgia. It's gratitude. It's a way of preserving the truth about a man who gave so much of himself to every scene, every co-star, and every story he told. So when audiences revisit Murphy's Romance today, they aren't just watching a movie. They are witnessing a rare kind of magic. Two people from opposite worlds, carrying all the weight of their histories, meeting in the middle to create something timeless. And when Sally Field finally speaks about James Garner, she reminds us why we still care, because kindness, respect, and authenticity never go out of style.